On the cold evening of December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat alone in his Kremlin office and signed the document that would erase the Soviet Union from the map of the world. He handed over the nuclear briefcase, the device that controlled 45,000 warheads, to Boris Yeltsin, the man who would soon lead a nation that did not yet exist. The next evening, as winter darkness fell over Moscow, soldiers lowered the red hammer-and-sickle flag from the Kremlin dome for the final time in history. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a superpower that had terrified the planet for nearly 70 years, simply ceased to be. It had commanded the largest army on Earth, occupied 11 time zones, and promised to bury the capitalist West in the ash heap of history. Yet not a single American soldier had fired a single shot to bring it down. This is the story of the longest and strangest war ever fought, a war waged with dollars instead of bullets, with microchips instead of missiles, and with patience instead of invasions. It is the story of how the United States of America quietly and methodically destroyed an empire without ever declaring war upon it. Before we dive in, why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps this video reach more people. The strategy that would eventually kill the Soviet Union was born not in the Pentagon, but in a diplomat's office in Moscow in February of 1946. George Kennan was an American Foreign Service officer who had spent years watching the Soviet system from the inside, studying its paranoia and its brittle authoritarian logic. When Washington asked him to explain Soviet behavior, he responded with an 8,000-word telegram that would reshape American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. Kennan argued that the Soviet system was not the unstoppable juggernaut it appeared to be, but rather a structure rotting from within, held together by fear and lies. The United States did not need to invade Russia or bomb Moscow into rubble. It simply needed to draw a line and wait, contain the Soviet Union, deny it the expansion it needed to survive, and the internal contradictions of communism would eventually tear the system apart from the inside. It was an elegant theory, but it required something that Americans were not famous for possessing: the patience to wage a war measured not in months, but in generations. The first test came quickly, and it came in the divided city of Berlin. In June of 1948, Joseph Stalin ordered a blockade of all road and rail routes into the western sectors of the city, trapping 2 million people behind Soviet lines. Stalin calculated that the Americans faced an impossible choice: abandon Berlin and look weak, or force the blockade and risk starting the Third World War. What he did not anticipate was that the Americans would find a third option that made him look like a fool. For 11 months, American and British aircraft landed in Berlin every 90 seconds, around the clock, in snow and fog and darkness, delivering 2 million tons of food and coal and medicine. Soviet soldiers stood at the edge of the runways and watched helplessly as the planes thundered overhead, unable to stop them without firing the first shot of a war they could not win. In May of 1949, Stalin quietly lifted the blockade, having achieved nothing except to demonstrate that when the Soviet Union bluffed, America would call it. That same year, 12 nations signed a treaty in Washington creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance that wrapped around the Soviet Union like a noose. The cage that Kennan had envisioned in his telegram was beginning to take shape, and Moscow was locked inside it. Throughout the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency waged a shadow war across the globe, toppling governments that drifted toward Moscow and propping up those that faced west. In Iran in 1953, American agents orchestrated the overthrow of a prime minister who had nationalized British oil, installing a monarch who would keep the petroleum flowing and the Soviets frozen out. A year later in Guatemala, another CIA operation removed a president whose land reforms looked suspiciously socialist, sending a message that communist expansion would be challenged even in America's backyard. When the people of Hungary rose up against Soviet rule in 1956, Russian tanks rolled into Budapest and crushed the rebellion beneath their treads, killing thousands in the streets. The West watched in horror, but the Kremlin had made a catastrophic error. The brutality was broadcast around the world, exposing the violence required to keep the communist empire intact. America did not need to intervene. Soviet actions were condemning themselves in the court of global opinion. The next battlefield was not on Earth at all, but in the black void above it. In October of 1957, a Soviet rocket hurled a small metal sphere called Sputnik into orbit around the Earth, and its steady beep sent shockwaves of fear through the American public. The Russians had beaten America into space, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though the future belonged to Moscow. What the panicking American public did not understand was that this race would become a trap that would bleed the Soviet treasury for decades. The communist command economy could achieve spectacular singular goals by concentrating every resource on a single point, but it could not sustain broad technological progress across an entire society. Every ruble spent launching cosmonauts into orbit was a ruble not spent feeding hungry workers or modernizing collapsing factories. America responded to Sputnik by creating NASA and committing to land a man on the moon before the decade was out, a challenge that played directly to American strengths: innovation, private enterprise, and sheer industrial depth. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and planted an American flag in the gray dust where Soviet cosmonauts would never stand. Moscow had spent billions trying to win the space race and had lost in front of the entire world. The psychological wound would never fully heal. But rockets were not the technology that would ultimately doom the Soviet system. That distinction belonged to something far smaller and far more revolutionary. In laboratories across California and Massachusetts, American scientists were developing transistors, integrated circuits, and the foundations of what would become the computer revolution. Soviet scientists, isolated behind the Iron Curtain and strangled by the inefficiencies of central planning, fell further behind with every passing year, unable to copy what they could not understand. In 1961, the Soviets revealed their weakness to the world in the starkest and most humiliating way imaginable. Rather than compete with the prosperous shop windows and bright lights of West Berlin, they built a wall of concrete and barbed wire to imprison their own citizens. The Berlin Wall became the perfect symbol of a system that could only survive by preventing its people from leaving, an admission of failure written in cement and guard towers. 1 year later, the two superpowers came closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other moment in human history. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, in a gamble of breathtaking recklessness, placed nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 days in October of 1962, the world held its breath as American warships blockaded the island and Soviet freighters steamed toward the quarantine line. In the end, it was Khrushchev who blinked, ordering his ships to turn around and agreeing to remove the missiles under the watchful eyes of American reconnaissance planes. Soviet officials privately called it a humiliation, and the crisis revealed a truth that would echo through the decades. When pushed to the brink, Moscow would retreat rather than risk destruction. President Richard Nixon understood that the communist world was not the monolithic block it pretended to be, and he found its deepest fracture and drove a wedge into it. In February of 1972, Nixon flew to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist dictator who had been Moscow's most important ally for 2 decades. Overnight, the strategic map of the world was redrawn, and the Kremlin faced a nightmare scenario that no amount of tanks or missiles could resolve. The Soviet Union now had to defend a 4,000-mile border against 1 billion hostile Chinese while still confronting NATO in the West, stretching its resources thinner than any military campaign could have achieved. Nixon had accomplished with a handshake what 100 army divisions could not have done. He had split the communist world in two. By the middle of the 1970s, the cracks in the Soviet foundation were spreading faster than the Kremlin could patch them. The command economy, which was supposed to prove the superiority of socialist planning, could not grow enough food to feed its own people. Every year, the Soviet Union was forced to import millions of tons of grain from the United States, a humiliation so profound that the workers' paradise could not feed its workers. The nations of Eastern Europe, supposedly grateful allies liberated by the Red Army, had become massive economic burdens, draining Moscow's resources rather than contributing to them. In 1975, the Soviets made a miscalculation that seemed like a triumph at the time, but would haunt them for the rest of their existence. At a conference in Helsinki, Soviet diplomats signed accords that included provisions on human rights in exchange for Western recognition of the post-war borders of Europe. Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content, so please hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps more than you think. With that said, let's get back to it. The Kremlin believed it had won a great victory, gaining legitimacy for its European empire at the cost of a few meaningless words about freedom of speech. But those words were not meaningless. They were a loaded weapon that dissidents across Eastern Europe would aim directly at their oppressors. Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia and Helsinki watch groups across the communist bloc emerged to hold their governments accountable to the agreements that Moscow itself had signed. The Soviets had written their own arrest warrant and handed it to their enemies. In October of 1978, a Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyla was elected pope, taking the name John Paul II and becoming the first non-Italian pontiff in over 4 centuries. For the first time in history, the Vatican was led by a man who had lived under communist rule and understood its cruelties and its weaknesses from the inside. When the Pope visited his homeland in 1979, over 1 million Poles gathered to see him, demonstrating that faith and national identity had survived everything the communists had tried to destroy. The seeds of the Solidarity movement were planted in Polish soil that summer, watered by hope flowing from Rome. That same year, President Jimmy Carter normalized diplomatic relations with China, completing the strategic encirclement that had begun with Nixon's handshake 7 years earlier. The Soviet Union was now surrounded on all sides: NATO to the west, a hostile China to the east, and American allies controlling the oceans that connected the world. And then, in the final days of 1979, the Soviets made the catastrophic blunder that would bleed them for the next decade. In December, 80,000 Soviet soldiers crossed the border into Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government that was losing a civil war against its own people. The Kremlin expected a quick and surgical operation, a few months of fighting before order was restored and the troops could return home as heroes. Instead, they had stepped into a trap from which there would be no escape, a meat grinder that would consume men and money and morale until there was nothing left. The mountains of Afghanistan had been swallowing invaders for centuries, from Alexander the Great to the British Empire, and they would swallow the Soviets too. The Central Intelligence Agency saw the opportunity immediately and launched Operation Cyclone, which would become the largest and most expensive covert operation in American history. Billions of dollars flowed to the Afghan Mujahideen fighters through the labyrinthine channels of Pakistan's intelligence service, buying weapons and ammunition and hope. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski later admitted the goal with chilling clarity. They wanted to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, a war that could not be won and could not be abandoned. The Soviets had superior firepower, tanks and helicopters and jets, but they faced an enemy that knew every mountain pass, every hidden valley, and would never surrender. In January of 1981, Ronald Reagan walked into the White House with an approach to the Cold War that was fundamentally different from every president who had come before him. Where his predecessors had sought to manage the Soviet threat and maintain a stable balance of power, Reagan intended to end the Cold War by winning it. He ordered the largest peacetime military build-up in American history, a tidal wave of spending that would pour $2.4 trillion into the armed forces over 5 years. New B-1 bombers rolled off the assembly lines, MX missiles rose from their silos, Trident submarines slipped beneath the waves, and a 600-ship navy began to take shape. In 1983, American Pershing II missiles arrived in Western Europe, nuclear-tipped weapons capable of reaching Moscow in under 10 minutes, faster than the Soviet leadership could reach their bunkers. The men in the Kremlin, already paranoid and aging, became convinced that the United States was preparing to launch a nuclear-first strike that would decapitate the Soviet government. That November, a NATO exercise called Able Archer 83 simulated nuclear weapons release procedures with such disturbing realism that Soviet intelligence believed the attack had begun. The world came closer to nuclear war than at any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and most people on Earth never knew how close they came to dying. But Reagan understood something that his critics did not. The arms race was not merely a military competition but an economic one, and economics was a war America could not lose. The United States was spending roughly 6% of its gross domestic product on defense, a heavy burden but one that a dynamic capitalist economy could sustain. The Soviet Union, with an economy less than half the size, was spending somewhere between 15 and 25% of everything it produced just to keep pace. Every dollar that Washington poured into a new weapons system forced Moscow to match it from a treasury that was already running on fumes. The Kremlin faced an impossible choice: match American spending and starve the civilian economy into collapse, or fall behind militarily and watch the strategic balance tip toward Washington. In 1982, Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 32, a classified document that laid out a strategy not merely to contain the Soviet Union, but to break it. The goal was no longer peaceful coexistence or stable deterrence. The goal was victory, and every instrument of American power would be aimed at that single objective. CIA Director William Casey, a veteran of World War II intelligence operations, launched a global campaign of covert economic warfare against the Soviet Empire. One of the most damaging operations remained secret for years, until the men who executed it finally told the story. French intelligence had recruited a KGB colonel named Vladimir Vetrov, who provided the complete blueprint of Soviet technology theft operations across the Western world. The Farewell Dossier, as it came to be called, revealed that Moscow had been systematically stealing Western technology for decades, the only way it could keep pace with capitalist innovation. Instead of shutting down the pipeline, the CIA made a decision of breathtaking cunning. They would keep it open and poison what flowed through it. American intelligence began feeding the Soviets subtly flawed designs, sabotaged components, and defective software that would work just long enough to be installed in critical systems. In 1982, a piece of CIA-provided software controlling a natural gas pipeline in Siberia caused the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded, a blast so massive that American satellites initially suspected a nuclear detonation. The Soviets never knew how many of their systems had been corrupted. They could no longer trust the technology they had stolen, and they could not develop their own. Simultaneously, the Reagan administration tightened technology transfer restrictions through the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, blocking Soviet access to American computers, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing equipment. Without Western technology, Soviet industry could not modernize, and the gap between the two systems widened from a crack into a chasm that could never be crossed. In March of 1983, Reagan stood before a national television audience and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program immediately dubbed Star Wars by a skeptical press. The plan proposed a shield of space-based lasers and sensors that could shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles before they reached American soil, rendering Moscow's arsenal obsolete. American scientists debated whether such a system was even technically feasible, but that debate entirely missed the point. What mattered was that the Soviets believed it might be possible, and they knew with absolute certainty that they could never afford to build a counter-system. At the 1986 summit in Reykjavik, Iceland, Mikhail Gorbachev came to the table with an offer of sweeping nuclear arms reductions, deeper cuts than any Soviet leader had ever proposed. But there was a condition. Reagan must abandon Star Wars, must give up the technological dream that was keeping the Kremlin awake at night. Reagan refused, and the Soviets left Iceland knowing that they had lost the technological race and could never catch up no matter how many rubles they spent. But technology was not the only weapon in the American arsenal. There was another, quieter, and perhaps more devastating tool waiting to be deployed. The Soviet economy depended on oil and natural gas exports for the hard currency it needed to buy foreign grain, service foreign debts, and keep the entire creaking system alive. In 1985, the Reagan administration quietly convinced Saudi Arabia to open its oil spigots and flood the global market with crude. The price of oil collapsed from over $30 per barrel to under $10, and with it collapsed the financial foundation of the Soviet state. Moscow's hard currency earnings evaporated virtually overnight. The Kremlin could no longer afford to import the grain that fed its people or the technology that ran its factories. The Soviet Union was being strangled, slowly and quietly, by forces it could not fight because it could not even see them. In April of 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, spewing radioactive contamination across Europe and exposing Soviet incompetence to the entire world. The disaster was not merely a technological failure. It was a revelation of a system so corrupted by lies that it could not even admit a nuclear reactor was burning. Gorbachev later said that Chernobyl was the moment when the Soviet people stopped believing their government, the moment when the legitimacy of the entire system cracked beyond repair. Throughout these decades of economic warfare, the United States waged a parallel campaign for the hearts and minds of people trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Voice of America and Radio Free Europe broadcast news, music, and forbidden ideas through the static of Soviet jamming equipment that could never quite block out the signal. Citizens across the communist world learned that their governments lied about the West, lied about history, lied about everything that mattered. The truth seeped through every crack in the Iron Curtain, carried on radio waves and smuggled in suitcases. Western consumer culture proved to be a weapon more powerful than any missile. Blue jeans became symbols of freedom, rock music carried messages of rebellion, and Hollywood films showed lives of abundance that communism could never deliver. Young Soviets did not dream of dying for Marxist revolution. They dreamed of living like the Americans they saw on forbidden videotapes. In February of 1980, a team of American college students faced the legendary Soviet hockey squad at the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York. The Soviets had dominated international hockey for decades, their team a machine of state-sponsored athletic perfection, and no one gave the young Americans any chance of victory. But on that night, the impossible happened. The college kids defeated the empire, and a nation erupted in joy while Soviet officials watched in stunned disbelief. The miracle on ice was just a hockey game, but it was also a crack in the myth of Soviet invincibility broadcast to the world at the worst possible moment. That same year, the United States led a boycott of the Moscow Olympics to protest the invasion of Afghanistan, denying the Soviets the global celebration they had planned for years. When Moscow retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Games, the plan backfired spectacularly. America dominated the medal count, and the Soviets looked petty rather than powerful. In 1983, Reagan stood before an audience of evangelical Christians and called the Soviet Union an evil empire, shattering the diplomatic convention of treating Moscow as a legitimate partner in world affairs. 4 years later, he stood at the Berlin Wall in the shadow of the Brandenburg Gate and issued a challenge that would echo through history. "Mr. Gorbachev," he said, his voice carrying over the concrete barrier, "tear down this wall." Meanwhile, in the mountains of Afghanistan, the trap that America had set was slowly grinding the Soviet army into dust. In 1985, the CIA began supplying Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen, shoulder-fired weapons that could lock onto a Soviet helicopter and blow it out of the sky. Before the Stingers arrived, Soviet air power had been the decisive advantage, gunships raining death on villages while fighters hid helplessly in caves. After the Stingers, Soviet helicopters began falling from the Afghan sky like burning leaves, and pilots who had once flown with impunity now feared every ridgeline and every shadow. 15,000 Soviet soldiers died in those mountains, and hundreds of thousands more returned home broken in body and spirit, addicted to heroin, haunted by nightmares. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, of openness, meant that for the first time Soviet citizens could see the coffins coming home, and they turned against the war with a fury that shocked the Kremlin. In 1988, Moscow announced that it would withdraw from Afghanistan, the first major Soviet military defeat since the Red Army had crushed the Nazis 4 decades earlier. The empire that had seemed invincible was bleeding out in a place most of its citizens could not find on a map. By 1989, the pressure of 4 decades had become unbearable, and the Soviet Empire began to shatter like glass struck by a hammer. In June, Poland held semi-free elections, and the solidarity movement that had been born in the Gdansk shipyards swept to victory, winning 99 of 100 Senate seats. For the first time since Stalin's armies had imposed communist rule, a non-communist government took power in Eastern Europe, and the Kremlin did nothing to stop it. Hungary quietly opened its border with Austria. tearing the first hole in the Iron Curtain through which thousands of East Germans would soon flood. In Leipzig and Dresden and East Berlin, crowds began gathering in the streets, at first hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands, chanting for freedom while the secret police watched helplessly. On the night of November 9, 1989, confused East German border guards received contradictory orders, and when crowds gathered at the checkpoints, they did something that no one had ever done. They opened the gates. Thousands of East Berliners streamed through into the west, many of them weeping as they touched the other side of the wall for the first time in their lives. Within hours, ordinary citizens were attacking the concrete with hammers and picks, while soldiers who had once shot defectors stood by and watched, their rifles useless. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of Soviet power that had stood for 28 years, fell in a single night, and the world would never be the same. The dominoes fell faster than anyone could have predicted. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution swept away its communist government in just 10 days of peaceful protest. In Romania, the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, who had ruled with an iron fist for 2 decades, was overthrown by his own people and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. In August, 2 million people across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined hands to form a human chain stretching over 400 miles, the Baltic Way that proclaimed 3 nations' determination to be free. And through all of this, through the collapse of everything they had built over 40 years, the Kremlin did nothing. No Soviet tanks rolled into Warsaw to crush solidarity, no paratroopers landed in Berlin to restore the wall, no bombers struck the Baltic states to punish their defiance. The empire that had ruthlessly crushed Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 was too exhausted, too broke, and too broken to lift a finger against its own disintegration. Gorbachev understood what his predecessors had refused to see. The cost of holding the empire together had become greater than the empire was worth. In 1990, Lithuania became the first Soviet republic to declare independence, and the unraveling accelerated beyond anyone's ability to control. Germany reunified, with the eastern half absorbed into NATO, the exact outcome that the Soviet Union had spent 40 years and countless lives trying to prevent. The Soviet economy, starved of oil revenue and crushed by military spending, entered a death spiral. The ruble became worthless, store shelves stood empty, and food rationing returned to cities that had not seen it since the siege of Leningrad. Republic after republic demanded sovereignty, and Moscow lacked the money, the military credibility, and the ideological legitimacy to tell them no. In August of 1991, a group of communist hardliners launched a coup against Gorbachev, desperate to restore central control before the entire Union collapsed into dust. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, climbed onto a tank outside the parliament building and rallied the people of Moscow against the plotters in a moment of defiance that would be remembered for generations. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed, and with it collapsed the last hope of anyone who still believed the Soviet system could be saved. On December 1st, 1991, the people of Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for independence in a referendum that sealed the Soviet Union's fate. There could be no union without Ukraine. The leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine met in a hunting lodge in the Belarusian forest and signed the documents dissolving the nation their predecessors had created. On Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television to announce his resignation as president of a country that would not exist when the sun rose the next morning. He signed the papers, handed over the nuclear codes, and walked out of the Kremlin into the cold Moscow night, the last leader of an empire that had vanished. The following evening, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin dome and the Russian tricolor rose in its place to greet a world that suddenly looked very different. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which had promised world revolution and threatened nuclear annihilation, disappeared from the earth without an invasion, without a battle, without a war. The United States had won with a strategy conceived in a diplomat's telegram 45 years earlier, a strategy that required not courage under fire, but something far harder: patience. Containment had built the cage that prevented Soviet expansion during the years when communist ideology still held appeal for millions around the world. Technology had outpaced an economy that could copy Western inventions but could never innovate, never create, never leap forward on its own. Afghanistan had bled them of soldiers, rubles, and the morale of a generation that came home in coffins or came home broken. The oil price collapse had starved their economy of the hard currency it needed to buy the food their farms could not grow and the machines their factories could not build. The arms race had forced them to spend money they did not have on weapons they could not afford, while their people stood in bread lines that stretched around city blocks. Star Wars had convinced them they faced a technological future they could never match, no matter how many scientists they trained or how many secrets they stole. Sanctions had frozen their ability to modernize while the West accelerated into the computer age and left them stranded in an industrial past. Radio broadcasts and rock music and blue jeans had won hearts that communist ideology could never capture, showing people behind the Iron Curtain a world of freedom and abundance. And when Eastern Europe finally rose up, when the people of Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and East Germany demanded their freedom, the empire simply did not have the strength to push back. The Soviet Union did not fall to armies or to bombs or to any weapon that kills. It fell to exhaustion, to bankruptcy, to the slow strangulation of an economy that could never compete, and to the loss of belief among its own people that the future belonged to them. For 45 years, the United States had waged a war of patience, pressure, and economic power, trusting that the system Kennan had diagnosed in 1946 would eventually destroy itself. America spent the Soviet Union into oblivion, trapped it in unwinnable wars, corrupted its stolen technology, collapsed the price of its only valuable export, and broadcast hope into the hearts of millions living under oppression. In the end, the workers' paradise could not provide for its workers. The revolutionary state could not inspire revolution, and the superpower could not project power beyond its own crumbling borders. The hammer and sickle came down not because America invaded, but because America endured, because it built a system that could outlast, outspend, and out-innovate any tyranny that rose against it. The Cold War proved that some victories do not require a single shot, only the wisdom to recognize that your enemy is already destroying himself, and the patience to let him finish the job. The greatest empire built on the promise of the future discovered that it had no future, only a past mortgaged to an ideology that could not deliver on any of its promises. And so it ended, not with a bang, but with a signature on a winter evening, a flag lowered in the darkness, and the quiet triumph of a nation that had wagered everything on the belief that freedom would outlast tyranny. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for watching.